video is going to show you results from an experimental research tool exploring expert consumer health belief misalignments for 20 carbohydrate-rich foods. Health belief misalignment is important if we want to realize the claimed benefits of nutrition as the largest opportunity for reducing rising chronic disease rates and living healthier lives. My name is Josh Marino. I'm a bioengineer by training, where I worked in a wet lab and studied the therapeutic potential of regenerative medicine and immunomodulatory biomaterials in chronic diseases. Had a bit of a plot twist about midway through my postdoc fellowship at Tufts University, where I transitioned into biostatistics and nutrition. At Tufts, I created algorithms and applied statistical models to both the Global Dietary Database and the Food Compass projects. Over the last 4 years, I've been independently building the Fresh Food Recommendations for Equitable, Sustainable Health platform, which aims to support better health decisions by making nutrition science more interactive, accurate, and actionable. I've been collaborating with Elisa Giardelli from NORC on this project, who led the qualitative consumer focus group sessions. Elisa has a master's in public health and is a registered dietitian with a strong research track record in campaign development and consumer interviews and surveys. Neither myself nor Elisa at NORC have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I want to give a general refresher and bird's eye view of this project. In collaboration with the Carbohydrate Committee at IFANS and NORC, we selected a list of 20 carbohydrate-rich foods to see how consumer health beliefs aligned with expert beliefs. The goal was to identify a short list of food priorities where there was the largest misalignment between consumers and experts, or where there was the largest disagreements among experts themselves. As part of the screener for their in-depth consumer group interviews, NORC asked consumers to rate the healthfulness of any given food in the list, and then they followed this up with, how certain are you? This certainty aspect was included in order to have more information to compare with a meta-nutrition profiling system from Fresh, which harmonizes multiple expert-included food rating systems and formally surfaces expert uncertainty in food ratings. We won't go into too many details of the meta-NPS today because they're the focus of the past 2 webinars, but a quick reminder that the misalignment results that you see shortly depend on the details and the limitations of that tool. At this point, before we dive in, I want you to take a few seconds to think about which foods in this list would fall into each of these 3 priority categories. You should answer 3 questions before we dive in, and feel free to hit pause if you're listening on YouTube. So out of these 20 foods, how many would receive a grade of C or D for consumers being well aligned with experts? How many of these foods would be classified as uncertainly healthy by experts? In other words, which foods might have some disagreement amongst only experts themselves? And finally, considering consumer expert misalignment, expert only disagreement, and how much of the food we eat in the United States, which 4 foods do you think you might want to prioritize for messaging? So what we found was that 17 out of 20 foods received a C or D, so that's 85% of the foods that we asked about for alignment grades. 15 out of 20 of the foods, so 75% of the foods were considered uncertain by experts, so there was large disagreements amongst experts. And the 4 overall priority foods that we found were white bread, fruit juice with vitamin C, white rice, and corn tortilla. And while these results are kind of cool and a little bit eye-opening, please remember that this project is really just getting started. Before we get into the rest of the results, I want to reiterate 2 things. First, experts are currently defined and operationalized using published nutrient profile models. This is without a doubt a restricted view of what constitutes an expert. However, it does raise more formal questions about who is an expert, whether there are different types of experts, and what insights we might learn by comparing across these different types of groups. Consider something like an epidemiologist, a dietitian, and a primary care doctor. Second, the limitations from the first 2 videos still apply to our interpretation of consumer expert alignment results. Namely, science doesn't currently have a method to evaluate the accuracy of any food rating system. You can think of creating a health algorithm or a food rating system kind of like throwing at a dart at a dartboard that either doesn't exist or that you currently can't see. This is one reason why I like to emphasize that even seemingly objective algorithms are reflections of expert beliefs and subjective algorithmic choices. even though they're more principled and transparent than other methods used for making health decisions. And all of these things are reasons why I believe that stacking models and including multiple experts and including model uncertainty will be incredibly useful in nutrition science like they are in other fields like weather forecasting. Zooming out a little bit, we initially discovered that almost every food was either misaligned or in disagreement, except for apple and soda. So 18 out of the 20 foods that we asked, fell into either one of these categories, obviously in their respective column being shown in red. These results were a little surprising and needed further information in order to come up with a more shortlisted, targeted list of priorities, maybe somewhere around 5 foods. So what I did was propose to layer in consumption preliminarily, and then I ended up creating this kind of tool. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit now and give a sense for how this tool works. In order to give flexibility into anyone making decisions or setting priorities and to reflect that this is an ongoing collaborative project, I created this interactive tool in Fresh. Before we interpret anything down here, let me walk you through what you're seeing. So at the top of this tool, you have drop-down menus that allow any user to filter by things like alignment grade from A to D, from consumption, separated into 3 categories: high carbohydrate intake to low carbohydrate intake, expert classification from healthy down to unhealthy, and food category from beverages down to snacks. The consumption quantities were estimated using, for the US population, age 4 and up, using 2017 and 2018 NHANES data. This cool circle under the misperception column represents a combination of 2 things: the misperception composition, which is reflected in the color proportions, either purple or orange or a mix, as well as the total misperception based on the size of the circle. So positive orange, as in this case, indicates that the consumers thought it was more healthy than the experts. Negative misperception in purple generally indicates that consumers thought it was less healthy than the experts. So if we take honey as an example, you can interpret this circle by saying that honey was the most misperceived food with a predominantly positive consumer misperception composition. In contrast, French fries was the second most misperceived food with a predominantly negative consumer perception relative to experts. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, kind of what you might expect, that apple and soda were the most aligned of consumers relative to experts, even though they still exhibited a consumer misperception signal. And if we just take a quick glance across all these foods, we can see that for almost every given food, consumer misperception can be both negative and positive. This means that there may be difficulties for one-size-fits-all messaging, and ultimately that aligning health perceptions may require a more bespoke, personalized approach. So in order to use this tool to arrive at a more manageable number of priorities, essentially what I did was filter by alignment grade. So I said anything that was a C or a D and fell into the high carbohydrate intake and was uncertain by experts. And we end up with this short list of foods. So we have white rice, corn tortilla, white bread, fruit juice, and vitamin C. Their respective misperception compositions and quantities are shown here. The green in consumption indicates that they're highly consumed, and then you obviously have their expert class of uncertain and the end alignment grade. So what we just saw was how we used this tool to identify 4 priority foods based on key criteria. They had high consumer misperception, an alignment grade of D or C, expert classification of uncertain, or consumption of high carbohydrate intake of greater than 1 gram of carbohydrate per day. Now I want to take another step back to look at all the foods in more detail in terms of consumer misperception relative to experts. Let's double click on this column right here. And now what you're seeing is a zoomed in and expanded version of the circles we looked at in the previous table, layered in and clustered by food groupings. On the y-axis, we have misperception, and the horizontal lines that you see here in green, yellow, and red denote the cutoffs that are currently used for assigning alignment grades. Then obviously on the right-hand side, we can see the alignment grade distribution. So there's 2 Ds, 15 Cs, 2 Bs, and 1 A. And essentially what we found was that in this sample of foods, misperception of consumers relative to experts was not really related in any material way to food group. It seems pretty much that most foods, 15 out of 20, all fell within a similar range, especially within this C range here. Something that this chart also shows or suggests is a predominantly negative perception across all of these foods. If you take a look at the preponderance of these purple bars across this whole chart relative to orange, you see that there's, a much more negative view of foods for this selection. And interestingly, this is a pattern that's also observed in Elisa's independent focus group sessions and qualitative interviews. So consumer misperception may be skewed overall towards being negative. We just have a negative view of foods. Let that sink in for a second. And really what we should be thinking is, how can we develop messaging that is food specific, yet still acknowledges trends across all these preliminary foods and honors the complexity of, even within a given food, that there can be divergence within the population about their perception. Now that we've gone in pretty detail in terms of consumer expert alignment, I want to take another step back and double click on where this expert uncertainty is coming from and what that kind of look like. We talked a little bit about this in the last two webinars, but for these specific foods, I want to give a sense of what the meta NPS shows. So now we're looking at a zoomed in and expanded version of the uncertain label for experts only, that layered in with food groupings and ordered in the same manner as the misalignment results. So all of this, again, is derived from the meta NPS, and more details can be found in those previous two videos. On the y-axis, what we have is a health percentile from 0 to 100. Higher meaning it's in the higher percentile, and that's generally the healthiest food that it can be. And for each food, the box plot shows the distribution of health ratings across 5 systems. So each one of these dots is a rating from one of these 5 systems listed here on the left. And what we can interpret for fruit juice, for 100% juice, is that the experts had a health rating in between somewhere around 30 all the way up to 100. That's a difference of somewhere around 70, which is why this food is colored in light gray and considered as uncertainly healthy. And just as a important note to suggest here that fruit juice with vitamin C, not 100% fruit juice, has a lower downward shifted distribution of healthfulness relative to 100% juice. I really like this figure because it showcases that expert agreement is possible. If you take a look at something like Apple, where there's a really tight spread or distribution of the health ratings, while at the same time contextualizing the extent of the disagreement for these carbohydrate-rich foods. So if I'm looking in the grain section, for example, what I see is just like pretty much it's almost all completely uncertain. And this is in alignment with results that we talked about on the previous webinar from the Insights video. To summarize, we've created an experimental framework and an interactive tool to prioritize foods based on consumer expert misperception, expert-only disagreements, and consumption. It's possible and reasonable to suggest that messaging and next steps should be tailored depending on the audience. So we're just kind of summarizing this with a little bit more foods here based on these 2 categories. So on the left, we have consumer expert priorities. You can see what's filtered up here. This is the short list of 8 foods, and pretty much because there's so much uncertainty in this current sample of foods, it's very similar for the expert-only priorities, with the exception of French fries, which was labeled as a neutral food based on the meta NPS and the experts. So moving forward, what are we thinking about doing next? I think it's really imperative that nutrient profiling system creators, or even just the general food health movement right now, should come together to resolve disagreements with a transparent process, if and whenever possible. It might even be the case that sometimes these disagreements are just genuinely disagreements, and we're going to have to find ways to communicate that in a clear way to consumers. Communication strategies intending to aid consumer decision-making should leverage expert consumer alignment to evaluate overall campaign efficacy. When I see that bullet point, I think about all of the comments and threads about misinformation out there. Well, how can you have misinformation if the experts themselves are kind of in disagreement for a bunch of these foods? And really what's important is that in the absence of a gold standard or known truth, that bidirectional education between consumers and experts, in tandem with more research to elicit our beliefs and create a more shared understanding of where they come from and why. All of that's really critical to moving the needle and delivering on the promises of nutrition science. I'd like to acknowledge Elisa Giardelli from NORC, Barbara Lyle from IFINS, the Carbohydrates Committee also from IFINS, and a bunch of other collaborators along the way. If Please reach out to me by email, LinkedIn message, or through my website with any questions, comments, or insights. And thank you for your time.